Okay, with the filmmaking team, Buster Keaton, Home, a feature film, play the documentary film festival with Jim Schaub, and we're with Ron Pesch. Ron's trying to figure out his video right now, but hopefully he can figure it out by the time the podcast is done. But it's a feature film about Buster Keaton, which, one of the greats silent movie stars of all time. And guys, like, this is a really extensive film about this gentleman. It's you got some good interviews. You got Carl Reiner is one of the interview subjects. This seems like a pretty extensive film. I'm curious about the what's the beginning seed of like how this film got made, because you got some footage that I'm sure many people don't have. So I'm just curious how it all came about.
Well, I'll start, and I'm sure Ron can pick up where I left off. But I'll speak for Ron. Ron's been researching Buster's relationship to Muskegon for 30 years, um, and so we got hooked up kind of serendipitously through another professor at the university I work at, and he said, you need to meet this guy. He had seen him give a presentation at a library about Buster, and he, he contacted this mutual friend of ours, and so we set up a meeting. And initially, they were asking me to direct it and produce it because of my previous documentary that I had done and the success. And I was a little skeptical because there were so many documentaries already on Buster, and I just thought, it's been done. A hard act to follow, one of the
Yeah.
best out there. Details his filmmaking career and all. And I thought, we don't need to retell, the story that's already been told with great access. They had access to Buster and all sorts of stuff. So, um, but then they started telling me about, well, this is the side of the story that never gets told. It's his childhood
It's
as a
true
vaudeville
origin
star.
story, right?
Yeah, and what he did during his summers to have fun, when he was a kid. And as I started learning more about these details of, him as a kid, I thought, well, this is kind of what made him the filmmaker he is, rolling down the dunes in Muskegon, humbling, he was already an acrobat as a child,
Mm.
but, the fishing and all the stuff he got to do as a child, we saw how that influenced his work later on. A lot of that stuff ended up in his films, but that's a part of the story that would never get told. They would, in a lot of the documentaries, they would briefly mention it, for
Mm.
maybe 5 minutes at the most, and then they would move on. So this was, and I started learning about him like he was a child star when he was 5, 6, 7 years old, like on the cover of magazines. And he was one of the original child stars. And he grew up in entertainment, and it was just fascinating to think, as a young kid traveling around the country on a train, and being the star of the show, be having billboards with your picture on it and stuff. So anyways, Ron and I got hooked up, and eventually they kind of convinced me that we should do this because there, is a part of the story that hadn't been told before. So
And you're, but the what the connection is that you guys are from his town, right? Like you guys.
right. Yep. Yeah. We're both from Muskegon and grew up here, and I knew Buster had been a Muskegonite, but I didn't know the details like Ron. And so, it was kind of, it was great that we ended up getting hooked up because, I love making documentary films, and I spend a lot of time, and I'm real meticulous about it. And this was a story that kind of had to be captured because, um, you know, people get old and pass away, and like getting access to James Karen and Carl Reiner, they both passed away
Yeah.
within about a year of us interviewing them. So just capturing their stories on film and then telling the story before that history fades away was important. And Ron can pick it up from here on his part of that research. And go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, it's really just a case, as I've said, I was fascinated by this history. I had seen the documentaries, and as I said to Jim and others, I said, why don't we flip this on its head? Those videos, if they speak of Muskegon at all or his vaudeville days, it occurs within the first 6 minutes, and then the subject kind of dropped. So let's turn this on its head and focus on those 6 minutes. And to have the chance to meet Jim and verbalize what I wanted to do with a filmmaker who could see a vision with it, it was a great opportunity.
So how did you guys, so someone connected you guys together, so you guys never met before making this film?
Nope.
Well, interestingly, we both went to the same high school. He was a little bit behind me, and I had graduated with his brother. But it was a library presentation that I had done. The individual at the library made a connection to a guy who was asking about Keaton, and that individual happened to work with Jim. And that's really how this all kind of rolled out. I had seen Jim's previous work, a movie called Up from the Bottoms, and I knew he was extremely capable of telling that story. And I had the opportunity to finally get that story out there.
Okay, so you guys met, and then basically the next stage is, okay, you're like James, you're like a little bit resistant because you're like, this has been told to death, but then let's do, it's almost like, it's like, you know how like there's a movie where like the act one, like say there's a biopic, and act one is like the origin story of like how the person becomes who they are, why, the reason why they're doing the biopic. So like there's that act one of like, oh, he grew up here and then he becomes famous kind of thing. You guys made act one, an act one feature film. That makes sense. Like you guys made the feature film of the origin story, which you're 100% right. It's like, if you even read bios, like I read biographies all the time, those are generally the interesting. I just finished reading Magic Johnson, basically, who's from Michigan. His biopic that just came out, his biography just came out. In the first like 30% of the film is about his time in Michigan, which was the most interesting time because it's things that we
Mm-hmm.
don't know. We all know about the Lakers for him, like, and then his AIDS and all that stuff. We all
Mm-hmm.
know all that story. We all know like inklings of it, right? So they're kind of retelling what we already know. Same with Buster Keaton, but what's most interesting about that is, even with your film, is like you said, it's how someone comes to be, like a little bit of luck, opportunity, like the character that he is, like the things that he's interested in. Like I'm assuming he's growing up in Michigan. He's not thinking he's going to become a big movie star. They didn't even know what movie star
Mm-hmm.
was then, right? So
Right, right,
yeah,
exactly.
so
Yeah,
that's the interesting part. That makes sense.
yeah. And
Yeah, I
the
kind
other
of
thing. Oh, go ahead, Ron.
I, I kind of apply it to Hemingway in Michigan, um, how it influenced what came next, and that's the same thing that we see here with Keaton.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
there's
I was
something
gonna
good, some water in Michigan, I guess, right? Some good water.
a lot of good water. Yeah. The other great thing that Ron brought to the project that kind of made me want to do it was, why don't you tell the story about um, Eleanor Keaton, Ron, and how
Well,
you know hooked up with
I
her. So
I did a lot of local research and kind of grew a reputation for knowing local things. And anyway, I was made put in touch with a gal from New Jersey, a gal named Patty Tobias, who happened to mention in our conversation that Eleanor Keaton, Buster's third wife, was still around. And I, in turn, happened to find her phone number in a in a California phone book and wrote it down and called her one day, just out of the blue. Mentioned said, "Hi, my name is Ron Pesch. I live in Muskegon, Michigan. Are you the Eleanor Keaton that was married to Buster?" And this gal that answered the phone goes, "Yes, I am. Did you say Muskegon?" I said, "Yes." She said, "He loved it there. It was his favorite place on earth."
Yeah.
And that really led to the chance to meet her. I was going on vacation with my wife to San Diego. I said, "Well, we're going to drive up to LA. What Buster Keaton things might we see when we're there?" And she said, "Well, come see me." That in turn led to a lunch meeting with Eleanor. I had asked her about a visit that Buster had made with her back in 1949 to Muskegon and asked her if she might have any photos. She ran off to another room, came back with a photo album, and it was filled with photos of Buster as a kid in Muskegon in the Actors Colony. And by the end of the trip, she lent me that photo album and
Wow.
a family scrapbook, and it came back to Muskegon with me. That she basically said, "Well, do with it what you want. Just send it back to me when you're done." And I always joke about it. I said I was absolutely terrified that that airplane might fall from the sky. Not so much that my wife and I would die, but all these precious artifacts would disappear. Well, fortunately, they made them back to Muskegon. I was able to make copies of photos, and we put out a little booklet on Keaton's ties to Muskegon and the Actors Colony, and that's just rolled forward here now 30 years later into this documentary.
So what do you think when she talked to you? Why do you think she trusted you? Like that's pretty, that's like she just met you and she gave you his albums. That's kind of
Oh,
amazing.
exactly. It is without question. And the scrapbook and the photo album now reside in Beverly Hills at the Academy Library. But I think she was a firm believer in trying to make Buster relevant. And here was a guy who knew the story. I'd done my research, I knew my background. I told her about her visit in 1949 to Muskegon with Buster and where they stayed. And I think she just felt a level of trust. But I think more importantly, she wanted to get as much of his story out there and to the modern day public as possible. Here's a guy that died in 1966. I'm visiting in like 1993. Um,
Yeah.
and she just felt a trust. And I'm eternally thankful for that. Ultimately, we had conventions here in Muskegon of the Buster Keaton Society. Um, and she came to Muskegon for those first three conventions before she passed away.
Wow. And so yeah, so it was 27 year like or like so you're saying 27 years after he died that
Right,
yeah,
right.
and then and so his like his memory is still with her and like yeah, and like I'm surprised like yeah, as James alluded that there was other documentaries made about him. I'm surprised nobody else snatched up the photo like another documentarian snatched up that photo album who made films about him and interviewed her and talked to her.
Well, the fascinating part for Keaton's story, I think, for the great majority of the public is um, the silent era, those classic silent films that
Sure.
everybody recognizes as genius. And that's the story. And of course, you've got the up and down tale of Keaton, but those early days seem to be forgotten.
Yeah.
And it's always fascinated me where you can see individuals find inspiration. And, Eleanor used to joke about Buster, she said, was the wettest comedian ever. He was constantly in the water. Well, in Muskegon, Michigan, you're surrounded by water. You've got
Your
Muskegon
Lake
Lake on
Michigan
one
is
side
yeah,
and
is your
Lake
backyard,
Michigan on
right?
the other.
Yeah.
And his cottage overlooked the water. It sat on a dune, and right down the end of that hill was a dock that he could dive off, and he did. They had boats, and he what you see in those classic silent films are what you see in Muskegon, Michigan. There was a boat that docked here that was called the Damfino, and it ultimately led to a Joke and a Keaton film, and we talk about that in the documentary. Um, it's just fascinating to see how some of those things you can see influence him later.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, the water analogy is perfect. It's a perfect analogy because you're right. Like he obviously knew how to swim and swim well, and so he used it in his films. So yeah, you're like so then it's all these kind of films that are your origin story, right? Like it's yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so talk to me about this mammoth project, right? So you guys obviously you got some obviously got all these photos of him, like you used stock photos of like or I guess images of like his films, splice in the film. You got the interviews. So you have to sit down and I'm assuming write a script or at least a game plan about how you're going to make this film. So tell me about kind of that process. If you guys kind of like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, how do we like tell this? What's the thematic? How do we tell this story?
Yeah, I think we met for, God, it was probably 6 to 8 months, um, like every couple of weeks, at least every month, with a team of people who, a lot of them experts on Buster Keaton in their own way. And, we kind of worked through what is unique about this story, what, we tried to focus it on certain areas of his life, because Ron had so much history and had put together that great booklet about Buster, and plus all the experts on Buster Keaton have been coming to Muskegon for the convention for 25 years at that point. So like all the authors of like books on Keaton had made that pilgrimage to Muskegon. So we had the benefit of all that information, and we kind of were able to go through it and focus what we thought were the most interesting things, the things that to tried to figure out how he became who he is, right? Like, what influence did his childhood on the road and in Muskegon and all that
Yeah.
have on his film career, and and his greatness. I mean, there's so many celebrities that say Buster is the best filmmaker. Jim Carrey, Carl Reiner says it in our film. The list of people that count him as their hero or their inspiration is endless, right? And how did he become that way? Was he born that way? And clearly he had talent as a young
Sure.
kid, but we wanted to kind of explore the things that other people hadn't explored,
Yeah.
and detail, and kind of, you could say he was in vaudeville. Well, we figured we had to kind of explain what vaudeville is to people,
Yeah.
so we got an expert on vaudeville, and we, it's like, you can mention things, but if you don't ever give them kind of any context or rich,
Yeah.
history about it, it's just a mention, So we did delve into areas that other people may not have, and it's maybe a little gratuitous, um, but we tried to tell it entertainingly, and so anyways, it kind of that helped us focus it. But clearly, we just started interviewing, and we opened a lot of open-ended questions with our subjects because they were the experts, and we wanted to find out what they thought were important. And then Ron actually did a rough edit of, I don't know, about a dozen hours of footage or more, and in kind of sections and categories, and then it kind of got whittled. It was about 3.5 hours the first rough, and we
Yeah.
brought it down. So yeah, I'm sure you know that process of kind of whittling it down, funneling it down, to the most important things, and you don't want to be redundant, and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. But, yeah.
But it's almost like
Um,
you did the film backwards. What I mean by that is that you set up his legend first. You set up who he was, and then you kind of went to like, okay, so how did he
yeah,
become,
yeah,
right?
yeah, and I think that was my original thought was, if we want to bring this to a newer audience, a younger audience, because that was our big challenge was, he lived over 130 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And that's when, so it's kind of hard to, um, get people to want to watch a documentary about some guy they've never heard of, right? So I think part of my goal and our goal was to give them a reason to want to learn about this guy.
Yeah.
Why was he so, important? And ultimately we had the goal of getting a whole bunch of celebrities to, give us sound bites and that kind of thing. But how it's difficult, and a lot of times they want stipends, and we were on a shoestring. So we were very fortunate to get Carl Reiner and James Karen, and but the idea was we just want to grab them and give them a reason to want to watch. We
Yeah.
thought if we start out with, well, back in 1895, it's
Yeah.
and after 3 minutes they're going to go click, so, and I hope
Well,
it worked. I mean, I hope we
it's
grabbed their attention.
as Jim
Right.
said, you've got an audience that you're chasing. I always joke about a Keaton film. I'll tell people they need to come see films when the Keaton group is in town. And, I mentioned you're going to hear this theater organ in this beautiful building that we have here in Muskegon. And they're like, Oregon? I'm like, yes. They're like, oh, that means it's probably a silent film.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, well, that probably means it's black and white too. Yeah, it's from that era. Um, what we recognized early, and Jim's got the talent to recognize those things and say, look, we've got to grab that audience. And the way we need to grab that audience first is by showing them Keaton and what he did and who he was, and then we can tell the rest of the story and how those early years influence what came next. And that's, the beauty of working with a filmmaker. They can edit, they can see what needs to happen. And that's exactly what Jim, is able to do. I can tell, and I'm a storyteller and I can go on for a long time if I need to. Um, Jim is capable to say, okay, let's whittle that down. Let's cut it down
Yeah.
to a point where we can grab an audience.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. But it's almost like things come and go, ebb and flow. I mean, and also too, people are interested in film history now. Like they're more like, from my experience, at least from where I'm sitting, the perch that I'm sitting in, is basically people seem to be more interested in like what the origin story of film, right? And you can't talk about film without Buster Keaton. So basically, and so you have to like talk about like obviously Chaplin. He's almost over, like you could make a whole movie about him being overshadowed by Chaplin, right? Because they always want to put one person on a pedestal to say, okay, that person represents that, right? So, but he's a different style, different, you know what I mean? But at the same time, it's like that's what your film is important. But also, I'm assuming that this film is about your town too, right?
Right.
It's an historical document of your town, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. That was a big part of it. And I had a lot of tough decisions to make because I realized that would probably limit the reach of it
Yeah.
by focusing, on the Muskegon part of it too much. Um, but you know what? I didn't want to, my goal was to tell the story, the whole story, and and I know it'll be seen by the people that want to see it, because if you're a Buster fan, you're usually pretty fanatic about it,
Yeah.
as we've learned. So people will find it, and today we can put it on streaming. We can, people can access it a lot of different ways. So I wasn't trying to, you know, whatever, make it a big hit in the festival circuit or whatever,
Yeah.
because I realized, lengthwise and focusing on Muskegon might limit that a little bit. But um I thought it was important, and partly because Ron is my co-producer and wanted to get this story told. I didn't, I kept referring or conferring with Ron about it and saying, would you
Mhm.
be okay if I cut this section out? Because it's his story as much as it was me telling the story. So
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure we were true to the story, and not like fall back into the groove of, let's focus on his films, and or
Yeah.
let's get big celebrities to try to attract more viewers. It was like, no, let's tell the story the way it needs to be
Well, I'm
told.
glad you're lucky. You were lucky to do that because I think that you were able. Some people sometimes you're not able to do that, and I'm glad you're lucky to do that. So,
Well,
curious. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the support from the community. We had
Yeah.
donations from several leaders in our community that helped us do this. I mean, without them, and without Kirk Hallman, who was our fundraiser, and also Frank Boring is the one who introduced Ron and I initially. Um, so yeah, the financial support, it wasn't as much as we wanted to make the film, but without it, it would have never been made. So yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's no, 100%. I was
Yeah,
just
and
going
I
to ask
think
you
they
with,
reckon.
to finish it off. What did you guys think about the audience? We send the audience to you. So this is like a, young generation. I'm assuming they know the name, but they don't know like exactly who he is. What did you think what they had to say about your film?
Go around.
Well, I think what's always fascinated me is that there's young people that come to this convention that we have here in Muskegon. The Damn Finos, the International Buster Keaton Society, has been coming to Muskegon since 1995, the 100th year anniversary of what would have been Keaton's birth. And especially for those that are interested in film, you're talking about a guy that's considered one of the greatest comedians ever. Um, he ran with Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, but he was also a director of really unparalleled abilities that those individuals that are interested in film see this thing as a means to learn about the guy that he became. And I think that's really, what we're hoping to do is relay the rest of the story, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I loved the comments. I thought they were great. And I appreciated the feedback they gave. So yeah.
Yeah, it was great to see the feedback from this showing that you guys had. It's nice to hear individuals say, "I didn't know that."
Yeah.
That's exactly what we wanted
Yeah.
people to say.
Yeah. And I hope it shows you that, like you said, I know that you're making kind of like a state film or an individual film, but there's a huge audience there, and I think that because you made it with integrity, what I mean is that you made it the film that you wanted to make, it will stay obviously stand the test of time in your community. People will watch this hopefully for decades, which is amazing, and also too, it kind of has that traction for okay, what do we when people are studying history and like you said, things ebb and flow, right? Eventually someone's going to make a movie about Hollywood movie about him, right? So then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you know what I mean? Like you never like the future is there. You got the document, you got the film, which is amazing.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate those comments.
Well, guys, I appreciate your time with this. I appreciate you submitting, and I'm glad you enjoyed the feedback. And let's like I hopefully I'm assuming you guys are keep making films because you're so proficient. So hopefully we can talk again when you guys make your next film.
Thanks a lot, and a really
Thanks
great
again.
festival. I appreciate everything about the festival. So
I
thanks.
appreciate that. Thank you so much.